everyone, and welcome to the BFI London Film Festival. I hope you enjoyed the screening of Friendship's Death, as well as the Q&As. So this is Peter Wollen, Politics Writing Film, a dialogue between Laura Mulvey and Kodwo Eshun. So my name is Wendy Russell, and I'm Special Collections Archivist at the BFI National Archive. The screening and the conversations around it are particularly exciting for me, as I've had the pleasure of working with Peter's archive, which is very dense, and it contains a vast amount of his published and unpublished articles and conference papers, his production papers for his films, including his scripts, his teaching notes, research and planning for exhibitions he curated, and also a favourite of mine, Peter's copious notebooks. One thing that this archive shows us is that Peter writes, and his subjects are varied, to say the least. So it seems very appropriate that today we discuss not only Friendship's Death, but Peter's writing. And with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our two esteemed guests today, Laura Mulvey and Kodwo Eshun. So Laura Mulvey is Professor of Film at Birkbeck College, University of London. She's author of Visual and Other Pleasures, Fetishism and Curiosity, Citizen Kane, Death 24 Times a Second, Stillness and the Moving Image, and After Images on cinema, women and changing times. She made 6 films in collaboration with Peter Wollen, including Riddles of the Sphinx and Frida Kahlo and Tina Modotti. And with artist filmmaker Mark Lewis, she's also made Disgraced Monuments and 23rd of August 2008. Kodwo Eshun is lecturer in contemporary art theory at Goldsmiths, University of London, and professor of visual arts at the Haute École d'Art and Design Genève, and co-founder of the Otolith Group. He is author of More Brilliant Than the Sun, Adventures in Sonic Fiction, with the 2nd edition coming out in 2021. And Dan Graham, Rock My Religion, and he's also co-editor of The Fisher Function, Post-Punk Then and Now, The Militant Image, A Cinegeography, The Ghosts of Songs, The Film Art of the Black Audio Film Collective, 1982 to 1998. So we'll start with you, Kodwo. The film sees an extraterrestrial robot accidentally end up in Amman during the middle of Black September 1970 in the company of a journalist. Why a robot and why Amman?
I mean, those are good questions. Are we even so sure that Friendship is a robot? She describes herself as a simulation. She describes herself as a highly sophisticated data gathering technology. I think I would say, she's a very specific kind of machine from this planet called Procyon. So she is both an alien, a simulation, a machine, and a robot. So the figure of Friendship allows Peter Wollen to personify all of his thinking about these questions. So Friendship as a simulation who is simultaneously an alien, who is simultaneously a robot, allows Peter Wollen to pose what we could call the riddles of simulation. So we understand that, of course, the famous film Riddles of the Sphinx that Peter Wollen made with Laura Mulvey opened out this question of the Sphinx in relation to femininity. But we could also say that Friendship's Death opens up the question of simulation in relation to the genre of science fiction itself, in relation to the particular political problematic of the Palestinian Liberation Organization and Palestinian liberation in general, and in relation to the figure of the alien body, what an alien is, what is its race, what is its sex, what is its gender. The very idea of the alien should challenge the idea of what a body is, of what a gender is, of what sexuality is, of what a race is. An alien is something at the limits of humanity. So when we see Friendship, who of course is played by Tilda Swinton in her 2nd role after Jarman's Last of England, she appears to us as a preternaturally calm, composed, controlled, young white woman of indeterminate accent and indeterminate age. I think we could see her as a way, as a narrative vehicle for thinking about the figure of the alien. To me, what friendship does that is really compelling is that, you know, her initial mission, as you say, is to be a peace envoy who lands at MIT and then goes to the United Nations. But the fact that she does not go to MIT and does not go to the United Nations, and the fact that she effectively is stranded from that mission that she has trained for, to me, that is Peter Wollen's way, in a way, of critiquing the entire tradition of science fiction from the day the Earth stood still in the 1950s, in which extraterrestrial white male envoys arrive on Earth and issue a warning to humankind. So that entire Cold War trajectory, to me, Friendship's Death is an intervention into that, frankly, imperialist tradition of white science fiction. And to me, Wollen sets out to destroy that. And in the ruins of that idea of science fiction as this notion of the galactic ambassador, the galactic envoy, other types of science fiction become possible. I would say, broadly speaking, Wollen is working out a kind of anti-imperialist science fiction. But because it's Wollen, this idea of an anti-imperialist science fiction is then wrapped up in several other projects. Part of what he replaces the idea of the imperialist extraterrestrial envoy who addresses humanity is the idea of the robot who finds themselves enslaved by automation. So when Friendship arrives, she rejects the turn to the US and the turn to the United Nations, and gradually sees herself in solidarity first with machines who are oppressed. She sees machines as oppressed technologies that are enslaved by humanity and forced to do humanity's work. And then in the implications of this understanding of machines as enslaved is a solidarity with Palestinians who are both forced into exile in Jordan, who are dispersed across many different territories, but who are aliens wherever they go. So in a way, what Wollen does is take the external perspective of Friendship and use that external perspective to rethink the idea of science fiction as such, the Cold War genre of it, and also to rethink the idea of how to imagine the question of Palestinian liberation, and then also to reimagine the figure of the android itself. All of these things are put into question, and all within the setting of the studio, which is a self-consciously and deliberately artificial space. I don't think there's any attempt to argue that we are really in Palestine. It's not a question of traveling to Jordan, traveling to Amman. The point is to recreate a controlled context in which these figures, the journalist and the simulation, have this dialogue, this duet, this dance of ideas. Because to me, they are both personifications of Wollen's thinking, of Wollen's theoretical thought, and of Wollen's fictional thought. To me, Wollen works to, in a way, take his ideas for a walk. He creates something like a controlled epistemic climate within this interior space, and within that, his ideas are choreographed. So they move across the room, they move across each other, they sit down, they stand up, they stand by the window, they stand by the wall, they move to the mirror, they sit by the chair, they watch TV. It's a choreography of a fictionalization of his long-standing preoccupations. Science fiction suits him because it's a cinema of ideas. So I think these are part of why he turns to the figure of the robot, because it allows him to enact and to dramatize and to perform ideas that he held for many years.
Laura, do you have a response to that before we move on to the next question?
There's a lot to take in there, Kodwo. That's really a fantastic summing up of how Peter's idea, I mean, the image of the ideas choreographing themselves around the hotel room is really very vivid and amazing. And I think it just did remind me of the way in which, in the story at any rate, it's quite clear that when the journalist, as he is, summarizes friendship's interests, which so far as I remember are childhood, sex, psychoanalysis, and the poetics of language, are very much Peter's interests. So it fits in, I think, very clearly with what the points that you were evoking there so vividly. So there is a way in which friendship is, of course, not Peter, but at the same time, quite conveniently, friendship does reflect ways in which Peter wants to work through his own ideas through this extraordinary figure that he conjures up.
I mean, speaking about Peter, and you're saying that, you know, there is this idea of friendship as Peter, in a sense. It does actually have an autobiographical element in the film, in that Peter found himself in Amman in September 1970. So, Laura, do you think you could tell us how Peter ended up in Amman then?
Yes, I mean, looking back on it, I think we might just remember as a starting point that it was September 1970, so we're almost exactly 40, we're just after 40 years after the events with which Friendship's death actually, the film Friendship's death actually begins. Peter was invited to a conference that was organized, I think, by the student wing of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was taking place at the beginning of September. Now, it's strange in thinking back on it. Tension had been rising between the Jordanian government and the Palestinian organizations that were then in Amman. More and more volunteers have been flocking to join the Fedayeen. They were a rather undisciplined but armed body of people, and the international tensions and the internal tensions within Jordan were really escalating out of control. And violence was, in a sense, on the cards before it actually broke out. So it's strange to think of this international conference taking place in a situation in which actually street fighting was indeed beginning to take place. Now, my sister Rosamond was actually at the conference as well, and it's been useful for me just to check with her that she was on her way back to England. She left the conference early and remembers being in Frankfurt Airport when the hijackings actually took place. Now, the aircraft that were hijacked, there were 3 hijackings, which was an operation from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which was a leftist breakaway group from the PLO. And there was a lot of tension between the Popular Front and the PLO itself. And so Arafat, for instance, would not necessarily have supported the hijacking, which involved hostage taking and so on. Now, I calculate that Peter, who arrived later in the conference, probably arrived in Amman around September the 6th, when the hijackings actually took place. So I reckon that he arrived at that kind of absolutely crucial moment. Now, I don't know in those circumstances what happened to the actual kind of running of the conference, though I believe that you, Wendy, in the archive have got the program of the conference.
We do, yes.
Thanks to Peter's incomparable ability to save bits of paper and the archive to preserving them, it's amazing that we've got that little bit of documentation still with us. But what I think is interesting, I shouldn't go on about this for too much longer, is that I vividly remember when Peter got back to London, the anecdote that he told about how he and people that he'd bumped into at the conference decided to go on this possibly ill-advised sightseeing expedition to see the Roman ruins at Jerash. Now, this story doesn't figure in the original short story, but it's a very important episode in the film when Peter allocates the incident to Friendship, who comes back and gives Sullivan a kind of blow-by-blow account of what's happened, which was more or less what had actually happened to Peter and his companions themselves. So it is an actual fantastic record to have that in the film of these left intellectuals kind of wandering out into a war zone to go and see a Roman ruin. It was a slightly more complicated politically in his version, but anyway, it's wonderful the way that it appears in the film. I think it's probably important to say that Peter ending up in Amman at this moment is to a certain extent very appropriate in terms of his interests and his political commitments. He'd had a strong interest in revolutionary movements in the Middle East since the time he'd spent in Tehran in the early 1960s, where he'd become involved with the student movement there. And one of the leaders, Mohsen Resvani, had become a friend, and they stayed in touch, having clandestine meetings while Mohsen was on the run and in hiding in various kind of European cities. So that's the kind of Amman background. An element of chance in certain ways that was quite perhaps typical of Peter, falling into events.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't jump straight from that straight to the film. Peter wrote a short story in '76 called Friendship's Death for a short-lived publication called Bananas, so I didn't know about that until I encountered the original cutting in the archive. So can you tell us about this text, Laura? Was this in keeping with his writing at the time, or was it an anomaly?
Both, Wendy, at the same time. It's very much in keeping with his experimental writing. It's also a tribute to his journalistic writing, but it's an anomaly in the sense that it's one of the unusual places in which he brought the two somewhat together into a kind of montage of his two different voices. Bananas was edited by Emma Tennant, who was a friend, but during the Bananas period, she and Peter talked a lot. They were in constant conversation about development strategies and so on. And I think this is a bit of a digression, but I think this was characteristic of the ways in which Peter related to the various small magazines, journals he was involved with. He tended to be the kind of person that people wanted to talk to, wanted to consult, wanted to get a direction from. He was very, very easygoing and also at the same time very quick with ideas. So that made a kind of good combination. And also he was very, very committed in his solidarity with the various journals he was involved with. But we can come back to that perhaps later on. I wanted to say something here about, it's a kind of aesthetic commitment that Peter had to the idea of the hybrid, the heterogeneous, which was something that's very important in his writings about the avant-garde and about modernity. The way that he loved work that was mixed, that was not pure. And I mean, you could say that in some ways he loved one of his interests in semiotics was his love for the actual hybridity of the sign, that he chose the semiotics of C.S. Peirce, which is definitely hybrid. He loved the polymorphousness of the cinema, the fact that it's such a kind of mixed medium, its resistance to abstraction, its actual kind of insistence on a relationship to the roughness of the world and the everyday. All those things, and anyone who knows his writings will know throughout his writings, he demands a sense of the politics of the hybrid and the heterogeneous, and also, of course, it's a very important principle in our own films. I mean, consciously so at the time. But what I'm trying to get to here is something slightly different. The way in which Peter, in his writing practice, this isn't theory aesthetics, this is his practice, actually developed different voices for his different areas of, well, what one might call his different areas of kind of interest and commitment. So I was thinking about this when I was preparing for our conversation today, and it seemed to me that that as he participated in these various radical cultures, that we might say that there were four voices. There wasn't a single particular Peter Wollen voice. He wasn't interested in finding his own essence or his own person, as it were. What he developed was the journalist voice, which might have started with the International Socialist Journal in Rome, but was certainly there in his pieces for New Left Review, which I think Kodwo will talk about later. There was his ideas pieces, his essayistic pieces, which we might talk about later. For instance, the 7 days ideas pieces. There was his film theory voice in Screen, in After Image, and all the film journals that he wrote for. And then there was his poetic littérateur voice, the voice of his experimental writing. And this, I think, is a very particular voice, and we find it in the Friendship's Death story, with Friendship's message, which in the story form is Friendship's translation of Mallarmé's Après-midi d'un faune, which is, I think, just an extraordinary piece of poetic writing. And during the film, when Sullivan steals Friendship's beautiful colored objects and puts them in water, her voice then speaks the opening lines. I think it's, "I vault to persecute these water lilies." So the Mallarmé is there, but of course it gets translated into something else in the end. So to my mind, Friendship's Death, the story, is the place where the presence of the journalist represents Peter's journalism voice, but also this extraordinary piece of work at the end is one of the main and most extraordinary examples of his literary poetic voice.
Yeah, Kodwo, would you like to respond to that at all?
Well, I was just going to say, sorry, I was just going to add that it's important to remember that the translation of the Mallarmé in the story then becomes Friendship's visual message. in the film,
Mm.
which becomes the coda of the film in the same way as the Mallarmé had been in the story.
Mm. Well, he definitely, this end part with her message, he definitely had an interest in videotape and technology, not just within the film itself, but filmmaking and so on. So I wondered if you have anything to say about what Laura's commented on Kodwo, but also about his interest in technology.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, what Laura has said about Peter's multiple writing voices, his personae, is really very generative, and hopefully will, in a way, open up the ways in which people have thought about his work. I mean, what we see in that movement from 1976 to 1987, in 1976, we see what is friendship's perverse, kind of polymorphously perverse translation of Mallarmé, which is also, in a way, the only evidence of friendship's existence that is left. So it becomes a kind of document of friendship that the unnamed journalist can leave. And then Wollen reassigns the gender of friendship, of course. In 1987, in 1976, friendship is male. In 1987, friendship turns from a simulation of masculinity to a simulation of femininity. And then similarly, friendship's translation, kind of peculiar translation of Mallarmé becomes friendship's notebook, actually. These colored crystal objects are, in fact, friendship's notes. In the film, they are notes that cannot be decoded by Sullivan, the Scottish correspondent, until his technological genius of a daughter, Catherine, works out how to migrate friendship's crystal communications onto a VHS cassette. And so Catherine puts the cassette into the cassette player. Sullivan presses the remote, and then we have those last 2.5 to 3 minutes of spectacular science fiction special effects, which are kind of an elaborate montage of about 18 different scenes. And in this scene, it's as if Wollen's ongoing interest in computation, in digital vision, in electronic vision, all meets in this computer graphic version of friendship's alien writing. And so what we see is the film ending on this alien notation, which is unreadable by anybody in the film, insofar as we never see the responses of Catherine or Sullivan. So we never know what they make of it. We are left with it. We, the viewers in 2020, we have to look at this vision of 1970, which plays out in 1987. In fact, what we see is what it's supposed to be is friendship's visions of 1970. It's that what we see, what those special effects are, friendship's notations of Amman, but to us they look, you know, there's kind of infrared imagery, there's kind of there's some kind of heat-seeking imagery, there's fractal imagery, there's kind of solarized imagery, there's different kinds of letter forms that are not readable. So it's a dramatic and powerful montage which evokes a kind of a technological vision from an advanced civilization in Zion. And so it's kind of Wollen's external view, Wollen's extraterrestrial view, in fact, of what Amman meant. And so part of what I think is going on in that final amazing scene is that that whole final scene is begins with both Sullivan and his humanitarian friend. They are trying to give a kind of historical verdict on 1970. And from the perspective of 87, as Western outsiders, their argument is that, well, 1970 was a failure. But when we look at that video, it is not so much that 1987 looks on 1970. It's more the other way around. It's more that this image of 1970 looks at 1987 and beyond. It's as if in other words, it's as if this vision from the past of 1970 comes from the future that 1987 has not yet caught up with. So you get a profound reversal of the direction of authority, in which it's not about Sullivan comprehending what he is watching. It's actually the other way around. It's actually the alien vision looking at humans' incapacity to understand what it means for this external view to enter into the kind of the territorial conditions of 1970. So it's a really profound moment, and that's why I think Edward Said described those scenes as filled with a kind of sadness and a pathos and a kind of a feeling that is almost mystical. Edward Said really he really loved Friendship's Death, and I think it's because a lot of what Wollen was thinking through actually resonated very strongly with his vision of Palestinian liberation as what he called an extraterritorial project. It's as if Friendship's extraterrestrial project is a fictional enactment of Edward Said's political vision of the future for Palestine. And so Edward Said's vision of the Palestinian future and Wollen's vision of this extraterrestrial vision of Palestine's extraterritorial future all combines in that domestic setting of North London in 1970, which effectively is expanded, at that moment. So it's such a profound moment, and it's difficult to put into words why it's so moving. When I first saw Friendship's Death at Whitechapel, in the series put together by Oliver Fouke and Nicholas Grove Helmers, I was really moved by it, and it's taken me several years to work out why that final scene is so powerful. I think it has a lot to do with the way in which a vision that seems to be from the past seems to comprehend us as if it's from the future. It's as if the direction of time, the capacity for judgment, and the relation between what is retrospective and what is perspective becomes reconfigured in that moment.
Well, that's amazing. Wendy, could I come in there for...
Absolutely.
I think that's so completely appropriate, the points you were making. If I could just go back to something you said earlier, because you mentioned fractals, and we could just then say one kind of practical thing that Chad Wollen, Peter's and my son, pointed out to me that around 1985, there was a widespread interest in the Mandelbrot set, which was actually circulating and I think had captured popular imagination. So there's a mixture of that kind of fractal with the interest in fractals with the computer technology. And there's something about the profundity, I don't know if profundity is the right word, because it's something that is, in a sense, has no depth, but at the same time goes into depth. And it resonates, and this is something that Chad pointed out to me, with Peter's interest in patterns, the way that his fascination with patterns, well, actually, it was one of the things we shared at this point in our films, work with pattern and symmetry and balance and so on, was something that ran through the aesthetics of our movies. But Peter was also interested in patterns of history, but also patterns of art movements, the way of modernisms, repetitions, and also, as Chad was pointing out, that fractals have a deep structure, and in that sense have a relationship with the structures of poetry, which we could say are not recurring elements, but are more recursive, the same but different. And I think that kind of adds a bit to what Kodwo was saying about that final, the poetics of the final friendship's message, friendship's notebooks. And as Wendy mentioned earlier, notebooks were absolutely crucial to Peter, in which he drew ideas as well as noting ideas.
I think in the archive there is actually, you know, the use of fractals wasn't, you know, it wasn't just, oh, here's a nice visual, let's put it in the film. You know, we can see from the archive, you know, he's read papers on fractals. You know, he's done research into what fractals are. And as for the language, I think he used a kind of Eskimo language, Inuit language. I can't remember what it's called, Inuktitut or something like this. But anyway, but yeah. So going back to you for a moment, Kodwo, you started to talk about, you know, Peter's, you mentioned Edward Said and so on, and you've mentioned kind of anti-imperialism. So you paid quite a bit of attention to Peter's writing under the pseudonym Lucian Ray, which he tended to use when engaging in more overtly political writing. So could I just ask you what drew you to Lucian Ray?
I think in the process of writing an essay on Friendship's Death, which is in a forthcoming volume on the works of Laura Mulvey and Peter Wollen, to be edited by Oliver Fuchs. In that process, I really stumbled across these essays that Peter Wollen had written under the name of Lucian Ray for New Left Review from the early 60s onwards, which I didn't really know about. I thought I'd read my way through the majority of Peter's published writings, but the more I read, the more it became clear to me that I barely scratched the surface, or rather that the writings of Peter Wollen that have been anthologized into published volumes are a very selected filtering of the actual breadth of writing that he actually embarked on. But to know that, you have to go back to the original New Left Reviews, which I did online, and there they are. They are the Lucian Ray texts, and sure enough, they are as exacting, as painstaking, and as as militant as you might imagine. There are, as Laura said, Wollen spent time in Iran, and there are two extensive essays at what he calls Persian politics. There's a later essay on the attempt of the Shah to put on trial Iranian international students, an essay which bristles with anger on behalf of those students who he clearly feels himself to be in solidarity with. There's essays on the unification of Tanganyika and Zanzibar. There are essays on Italian politics. I think most remarkable of all is an essay from 1966, which reconstructs the process of anti-communist massacres in Indonesia throughout 1965 and 1966. In this essay, Peter effectively revised and rewrote a lengthy text that had been published by Benedict Anderson, which was called the Cornell Report, which was really the first substantial report on the massacres of Indonesia's communists, which at the time was the third largest communist party in the world after the Soviets and the Chinese. The PKI was incredibly powerful. And in Peter's newly revised text called the Dossier on Indonesia, he reconstructs in painstaking and meticulous detail the complicated series of events which leads to the nightmarish massacre of hundreds of thousands of people in a matter of months. And it's such an unbelievably detailed account, and it ends in this like extremely powerful elegy, actually, in which Peter talks about the hope that the future, the future of Indonesia's Communist Party cannot really be imagined. But he says the consolation of the imagination is that the imagination can recreate and recrystallize the forms of future communists from the ruins of the PKI. This at the end of a detailed analysis. To me, that essay is, one of the most powerful essays on the anti-communist massacres, which is still being written about today, and is still, despite films such as The Act of Killing, The Look of Silence, is still not as well known as it should be. So Lucian Ray was a formidable political analyst, and to me, the tension of Friendship's Death comes from the way in which the kind of cynical realism of Sullivan plays off against the kind of not exactly the innocent, but the kind of the hopefulness of friendship, but all of that set within a kind of global media context, which projects the Palestinian cause onto a global media stage. And I think Peter wrote both as Lucian Ray wrote both as a political journalist and as somebody highly conscious of the mediation of imperialist politics. And then also as a figure of the New Left. It's not a surprise that most of these essays are written for New Left Review, so that they are part of the same milieu as figures like Perry Anderson and Robin Blackburn, and these kinds of figures of the New Left. And then I later found a kind of magazine that I'm ashamed to say I didn't even know existed, called 7 Days, which is from the early 70s, which Laura wrote a number of essays for, and a number of similar figures from the New Left Review milieu were also publishing, and Lucian Ray has some essays in there too. So, you know, I only hope that these writings of Peter Wollen will also be published. I think the 4 voices that Laura pointed to each deserve their own volumes,
Yes.
and hopefully that will happen, and not in the far distant future either. If not now, when? You know, they should be published right now. And what's more, there would be an audience for them. I mean, there just would be. People would love them, because I've shared these articles with people, and people are amazed by them.
Yeah.
They just had no idea. Not only are they never reprinted, but they never get referred to either. Film historians don't refer to them. New Left historians don't refer to them. So effectively, they just disappear. But why should they? So hopefully, you know, our conversation will just begin to draw attention to the importance of the pioneering essays.
Could I just come in about 7 days for a moment, very quickly? Because in 7 days, Peter wrote with what I think of as his essayistic voice as Peter Wollen, but it's very interesting to note that in addition to the famous Christmas piece he wrote called Was Christ a Collaborator, that Kodwo describes and analyzes in his essay for the book, he wrote about surrealism, the Oedipus complex, and contradiction. So you have there, you know, his love of, his interest in psychoanalytic theory, the influence of Marxism, the concept of contradiction, which he again interprets in terms of its hybridity as within a kind of image of clash and not reconciliation, as it were. But I wanted to mention the Oedipus complex, because I think Peter's interest in psychoanalysis can easily be overlooked and lost. And it just reminds me that in the story, when Sullivan is speculating to himself about how friendship came to land in Amman, the fault in his landing system, he attributes it to some kind of incipient desire, and that friendship perhaps had an Oedipal relationship implicitly to his controllers. So Sullivan has started, as it were, discovering an unconscious within this robot, which might fit in perhaps with some of the points that Kodwo was making earlier about the potential within this simulated creature.
I think that, if I might add, I think it also relates to the brilliance of Monuments of the Future.
Oh, yes.
Which also one of Peter's brilliant science fiction stories from the Bananas period, which to me is set in a kind of landscape of the unconscious.
Yes.
The unconscious as this interior subterranean space through which the figures literally descend in some kind of
elevator.
Yeah, some kind of elevator that literally takes them down. And as they go down, they discuss a fundamental disruption to the machinery of the infrastructural landscape of the unconscious. And they are effectively going to repair that infrastructure. Although, of course, one of them has ulterior motives and doesn't repair anything. In fact, he absconds and exits from repair because, in fact, he likes the fact that the infrastructural landscape of the unconscious has undergone some kind of breakdown. So that there, to me, the kind of the psychic architecture that Freud sketched and Lacan refined, Peter effectively envisioned as an architectural Piranesi-esque world. And as a result, I mean, that story of the first time I read it, I was so shocked. I was so shocked by how great it was. And I told everybody I knew, have you read this? Also, because I couldn't find anybody who'd ever talk about it.
But also, Kodwo, just to interrupt, I mean, it's interesting that that story was written in 1976. So there is a direct relationship, I think, between his thinking around friendship and that story as well.
Absolutely.
Which then comes out much more which comes out very articulately in the friendship story.
In talking about his, the variety of his writing here, Laura, you're actually about to publish a book which returns to Peter's and some of your scripts, which Kodwo, I know, has a chapter in. So maybe you'd like to say something about the book?
Yes. It's a book of the scripts of all Peter's and my 6 films, and also the script of Friendship's Death and the story published next to each other, which is a very nice development. And then there are a couple of scripts of the films that I did later on with Mark Lewis and so on. But what's relevant now, and what I'm really very anxious to talk about, is the way in which Peter wrote for those films. I mean, Peter and I collaborated absolutely totally in the creation of all the movies. They were a complete collaboration. But within that collaboration, he also wrote, and wrote not collaboratively. We used his writing in the way that we might have used, say, our composer's music. It was a contribution, as it were, from someone, and this person was Peter. And and so one of the things that I think is really important about the script book, and one reason why it was I was keen to get it published, was that Peter's writings for the films can also be seen on the page, so they can be understood alongside the writings in Bananas, say. Because these are extremely complex texts. And in the Real Projective Plane that was published in Bananas, he is one of his tributes to the surrealist writer Raymond Roussel, who is an important influence on him, and was one of the influences for what he calls a systematic procedure for deforming the ordinary use of language, which was to build up an arbitrary vocabulary and then construct a text around it. And he used that method for the mirror sequence in Riddles of the Sphinx, and he then uses it in a section of the Real Projective Plane. So that's just one example of how his writing fits across. It's not just to do with the films. The writing for the films relates to his writing in Bananas. So that will be coming out soon. But I also wanted to say something about the themes of the Friendship's Death story, how close to Peter's heart they were, and also the way in which his interest, I think his interest in the poetics of language was one reason why he felt very strongly about the politics of feminism. It was for him, one way he could identify with feminism was through his interest in the deformation of language, the systematic deforming of the ordinary use of language, which he saw as a gesture against patriarchal culture and everything that went with it. And I just think that, again, we can also overlook the way that Peter's feminism wasn't just solidarity, it was actually part of his interest in revolutionary politics more generally, and that his images in language, the unconscious, images as political, were also part of that a kind of inherent radical instinct that he had.
Just to actually, in a lot of his notebooks, you can actually see Peter is working things out to do with language. As an archivist, it's quite hard to catalogue because he really is working things out, and he's not necessarily always finding. It's more the process sometimes than even the conclusion. But I think with that, I'm just going to comment on this thing Kodwo was saying quickly before I ask the last question about these writings of Peter's, and you know, you ask people if they've read about it, read these works, and I think that, you know, there is definitely room for that to happen. And you know, I'm hoping that when the archive opens up, Peter's archive opens up to people, you know, maybe then we'll get more interest in people looking at that, because it has all of these published and unpublished papers. And it also really reflects something you mentioned, Kodwo, in a previous brief discussion we had. You referred to Peter's body of work as indisciplinary as opposed to interdisciplinary, which I think is really fitting. So I wondered if we could end this with just a final few comments from you both about that, about, you know, Peter's indisciplinarian writing.
I think it has something to do with what Laura called his many voices, his interest in the work of Fernando Pessoa, and his interest in heteronyms, in these multiple names, in a way that, if you take the idea of heteronyms seriously, the heteronyms are themselves a kind of vehicle for an indisciplinary thinking, which is not the same as undisciplined thinking, and it's not the same as interdisciplinary thinking. Interdisciplinary thinking would be somebody who has a kind of investment in one discipline and then connects that to another. Undisciplined thinking would be somebody who is eclectic in a more or less whimsical manner. Indisciplined thinking is somebody whose interests cannot be necessarily disciplined from the outset, and so whose interests cannot but take multiple forms from the outset, so that the hybridity is not a secondary feature. It's an originary impulse. It's hybrid from the outset. It's not pure and then it becomes hybrid. It's hybrid to begin with. And that impulse towards the hybridity is what then plays out as an indisciplinary mode. And I think it could be that effectively, you know, in a way, Peter's admirers in film theory have not known what to do with that indisciplinary perspective, and so have celebrated the film theoretical work at the expense of other works. So of course there's ways of saying, well, that's Peter Wollen's work on, you know, art practice, that's his exhibitionary work on curatorial projects. There's a way of dividing them up and giving each of them their own value and their own status. But that's not the same as, in a way, taking seriously the impulse from the outset. And the indisciplinary impulse makes a lot of trouble for the well-meaning effort to discipline knowledge as such. It makes trouble for it. And so I think that's part of why the breadth of Peter's work and the indisciplinary hybridic imperative has not had its due as yet. And I would hope that maybe our conversation would be a step towards actually acknowledging that in a way a certain foreclosure of that indisciplinary project has taken place, and you have to acknowledge that in order to undo it, and in order to, in a way, open up part of Wollen's work. And undoubtedly there were other figures as well, but Wollen stands as a paradigmatic example of an indisciplinary thinker whose work has been disciplined by his admirers.
That's one way of putting it, Kodwo.
Well-meaning
Yeah.
they were.
But I just wanted to add something, which is perhaps from a rather different perspective, because I think that's a very wonderful way of describing the indisciplinarity of it. That also, just going back to the 70s in particular, and into the early 80s, that to a certain extent, how involved Peter was with his moment, and to the extent to which he understood the demands and the priorities of the moment. So that his interest in revolutionary politics, his interest in contemporary music, his involvement with music now, with Bananas, with Screen, and so on, that he was able to kind of throw himself into all these different kinds of projects and enterprises, which were all absolutely crucial to the way in which culture was opening up during the 70s. So it's almost as though there was an illusion at the time that the radical movements of the 70s, particularly the cultural movements, were in a sense opening up the future. And these were opportunities that, as they opened up, Peter grasped them, as it were, and threw himself into them with with enormous enthusiasm. Doesn't really capture his particular personality, but with a really kind of deep fellow feeling in which he could help these various projects to go ahead, think themselves through. I mean, that moment of the 70s, as it were, as we all know, came rather kind of crashing down with the arrival of Thatcherism. But I think it's also to think on a more optimistic note that Kodwo mentioned earlier, that the moment of the film Friendship's Death does in a sense suggest that there was something kind of a pivotal point there in which Peter was also once again seeing an opportunity opening up and working with that opportunity, working in that opportunity, as it were, of the moment of the Friendship's Death film beyond the various kinds of initiatives of the radical 70s.
Laura, Kodwo, thank you so much.